Hello and welcome to this special seminar brought to you by the UCLA CARES Center and the UCLA Child OCD, Anxiety, and Tic Disorders program. I'm John Passantini, and I'm the director of these programs, and very excited to introduce Dr. Martin Franklin, who is going to be our speaker today. Dr. Franklin is the clinical director of Rogers Behavioral Health, which is the leading national network of hospitals for the intensive treatment of OCD and related disorders. He's also an emeritus associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. Dr. Franklin is an international expert in all things related to OCD, with specific expertise on the cognitive behavioral treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder, both in children and adolescents. He was the co-PI or the PI for a number of extremely influential studies, including the Pediatric OCD treatment studies 1, 2, and 3, which demonstrated, was the first comparison of medication, cognitive behavior therapy, and their combination for OCD. Second studies also looked at the evidence-based treatment of OCD in community practice, and he was the co-principal investigator for a study looking at evidence-based treatments, cognitive behavior therapy in very young children. It's a great honor to have Marty here at UCLA with us today, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy this talk, so I will turn it over to him.
Slide back into view. Am I evident on the screen? All right, good. Well, thank you so much. This is a real treat and an honor, and humbling, I would say. UCLA is known for many, many things, and one of them is not paging down. Can we go to the next slide? There we are. So this is a picture of your front yard, apparently, and also Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a native New Yorker, a fellow New Yorker, and it is a lot of fun. I walked by the Pauley Pavilion this morning, and I got goosebumps, I gotta say. Amazing. So delighted to be here and delighted to be talking about this topic, which is near and dear to me. Next slide. Disclosures. Apparently I have no financial or non-financial relationships, nor do any of my colleagues, which makes us sound kind of sad, but suffice it to say, nobody is paying me to say things. Next. So what we're going to try to cover here is the telehealth study, rationale and efficacy. We'll talk in detail about the current study, its clinical implications, some limitations we've got to acknowledge, and where are we going next. Where are we going next is exciting, I think, and I'm looking forward to walking you through those plans. Next one. Where does the project stand at present? Here, I'm in Los Angeles. I got a chance to go to Dodger Stadium in September for the first time. I'm a huge baseball fan. It was as good an experience as I thought it might be. And this was not in the midst of COVID, but certainly, we've had our share of it. And I'll be talking a lot about that COVID pandemic and its implications for treatment. Next one, please. So I had this slide in here a week ago, and I have more recent news. So we decided we were going to vet this abstract first, send it to the action editor at a major journal, and the action editor at the major journal is the guy with the sword in the front, and we've cleared him. He reminded me that there's an 87% rejection rate, so this is not a guarantee. We still have to get through the guy in the hood and the woman with the axe, but we're encouraged. So the paper that I'm presenting on today will be sometime in the next couple of weeks put through to this journal, and we're excited about the possibilities. Next one. So telehealth and psychiatry, psychology, there's an evidence base here. It's been around for a while. And if you look at healthcare in general, it's been around for quite a while. In terms of randomized studies looking at outcomes in disorders that aren't OCD, we've got them in depression, we've got them in substance abuse and PTSD. There are a handful of OCD studies as well in adults, and there's also some in teens. Those John Comer's trials, I was part of those. And we were testing, and this was parent involvement because the kids were little. But we were encouraged by what we got, and I think there's a lot more. That Lenhard study is out of Sweden. It's a much bigger study, and Storch did a web camera study at some point in 2011. So the initial information was encouraging. People were thinking maybe we should take this more seriously and consider it as an option to work on some of the gaps in practice that we see in most communities. Next one. So the question is it equivalent? Is it useful? And really, I think it's a question we have for every treatment. The holy grail is, for whom does this not work? Is there a kind of kid, a constellation of symptoms, a constellation of demographic variables that will lead you to say this kid shouldn't get telehealth? Because that's what we want to know. Because if it winds up to be comparable, then it might be a viable option to close this gap. But I want to know who's at risk to not benefit. So that's part of what we're going to be looking at. I'll introduce you to that, but we have much deeper dive to do there. So there was some interest in this topic for a decade or so in psychology and psychiatry, even in pediatrics. And that interest blew up when the world changed. Next slide. That hideous thing on the right is, as we all know, right? It's the virus. So COVID-19, clinical implications for us. So the rising tide raises all boats. If you were anxious or depressed before this happened, in all likelihood, your anxiety and depression may have gotten worse. If you had no anxiety and depression before this happened, you might have seen some increase in yours, but you were less vulnerable than the person who had it to begin with. And OCD is a particularly relevant boat. Think about this. A lot of my OCD patients with contamination fears after the start of this, they would come to my office and say, "I told you so." And me taking them to the train station to touch the floor and go eat pretzels, and they were delighted to let me know that I was right all along. And I'd still argue with them and say, it's not exactly. Most people are going to be okay, but you have a point. And there's some adjustments we had to make in how we do the treatment. But we had, with the pandemic, we had the problem of therapist unavailability. Places got shut down. We also had, if your place wasn't shut down, then maybe you didn't want to go there, or your parents didn't want to bring you there. So we had relevant issues to deal with, and we clinically had to shift immediately to trying to see, can we do this virtually? And again, we have a handful of studies, all of which are outpatient studies, and that becomes important. Looking at telehealth in outpatient settings. We had much less in terms of higher levels of care, which is where we're going with this. So the immediate need to shift, I think, opened up an opportunity. So let's hit the next slide. So this is October of 2020. And I look like I've been living hard for a bit. And those of you who are looking at me say, he's a little bit trimmer now. So there are a few things that grew during the pandemic. My ZZ Top cover band grew. But what I'd also say is the rates of anxiety and depression, according to CDC, indeed started to go up across the entire spectrum of people. And the demand for mental health services across the developmental spectrum also went up. More people needed help. And some people who were getting help may have needed help at a higher level of care. And so we have this dilemma of, we don't know, I don't think we did know, how this works. Telehealth, if you're talking about high levels of care, does telehealth, is there some sort of poop out effect where they just get tired of doing it? We certainly heard that in academic settings. It's hard for kids to pay attention for 6 hours to this sort of stuff. And it just, to me, struck me as an opportunity to study this delivery method, to determine its long-term viability as a method to bridge the mental health treatment access gap. And the mental health treatment access gap is not just about rural communities. I'll get to that in a bit. It is, but not just. Okay, next one. It's a debate that took place in my house. I was of the impression that the longer beard made me look like Brett Kiesel, the former defensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers. My kids, however, were more of the impression that it made me look like a garden gnome. And that hat I was wearing, the speckled hen hat, tends to get pointy when I wear it for a bit. And I have to concede, maybe, yeah, I'm a little tall for a garden gnome. I think it was my daughter who said, "But you're so good with the nomenclature." Oh, that's good. They make fun of me, but they make me laugh. You're laughing at me because you know you've met them. Okay, next slide. So the rationale for this study. COVID necessitated this pivot, provides us an opportunity we want to take advantage of. These large samples. Rogers, one of the things at Rogers, we have a lot of sites. We were up to 15, and we've got Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. We've got all sorts of levels of care there, and we collect patients quickly. We also have automated data entry. So this data goes straight in. Since 2015, there's nobody in a dank basement putting numbers in. The patients put it in themselves, so it's easier to access. And Brian Kay is our IT god, and he does a tremendous job at Rogers, making sure we can access this data quickly. Really a whiz. I thank Brian for his help. So we have a large patient database, large enough, in fact, to allow us to do matching procedures. So the kids who were seen during the pandemic virtually, we can match them on demographic variables, which is what we did, to develop a comparison group, because we didn't have a comparison group of in-person during the pandemic because there were so few people being seen in person by us or by anybody else. So we had this odd opportunity, raises some questions at the back end, but we're trying to make the most of what we have. And I think there's some practical real world implications for the data we're going to look at. Especially for kids being treated at a higher level of care, because there's a legitimate question to ask. Okay, it works in outpatient. Would this work at a higher level of care, where you need a kid to be signed on off and on for 6 hours a day? Legitimate question, and I think it deserves an answer, and I think it has one. Next slide. So let me just get back a little bit to the context in which I'm going to be talking. It was part of a big examination, meta-analytic study looking at the SciBox and various criteria for the SciBox, and we collapsed across maybe 15, 20 studies. It came up with 1,234 patients. You do the math there, and then what you see, individual breakdown. The bigger studies, and you'd be excited back in the day for a study with 67 patients in it who had pediatric OCD. That was a Lenhart study. John's study in 2011, 71 patients. We had Paula Barrett do a randomized control trial with 77, looking at individual and family CBT versus a wait list. Derek Bolton did a study in England looking at brief and full-on cognitively oriented treatments versus a wait list, POTS 1, 2, and junior. Those sample sizes were 112, 124, 127. And trust me, we were breaking our arms, patting ourselves on the back with those numbers. We were dancing a jig, as they would say, in my home country. So we were happy. Storch exceeded that more recently, looking at a DCS enhancement study, so full CBT plus DCS versus full CBT plus placebo. Didn't turn out that DCS enhanced much of anything, but it's a big study, and they have a lot of kids now treated, 142 treated with full CBT. That's another nice place to start looking for moderators, mediators, and things that'll help us get to that holy grail. Who's gonna respond? Who's not gonna respond? And TORP, this was the Nordlot study, which I was part of for 7 years. I spent a lot of my time in Norway, which is a fabulous thing. I went to a place called Tromsø in January. Tromsø is the northernmost city in the world, and I went out for an early morning walk. And the fellow at the hotel desk, he asked me offhandedly. He said, "Are you carrying a rifle?" I said, "No. Why would I need a rifle? Is the crime up here worse than I thought?" He said, "No, but this time of the day, the polar bears tend to come down to eat." We're talking north of the Arctic Circle. And we got a trip out as part of this to see the northern lights on the tundra, and it was minus 20 degrees air temperature. I spent 4 years in Buffalo, New York. This is fabulous, but minus 20 degrees, it'll get your attention. So in the context of the stuff that they were doing, Nordlot's cut across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It was an open trial, essentially, of 269 kids. They gave everybody weekly CBT, and then they randomized them if they were partial or non-responders to CBT. and they randomized them to get more CBT or to get the addition of sertraline. We thought we'd get about a 50% response rate because we were having non-experts provide the treatment. And the first part of this study basically blew up the second part, because the first part of it, we got 70%, not 50. So the sample size for the second part, I think we had 100 randomized in the second part. And it turns out it didn't look like it bloody mattered. If you added CBT to somebody who already had a course, they got another 10-point Y box reduction. If you added sertraline to the person who had a full course, they had about a 9-point Y box reduction. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the sample size, 269, that was as big a single study as has ever been conducted that I'm aware of. You aware of any more that are bigger?
No.
So Nordlots was a lot of fun. I got to see the Northern Lights. I didn't have to shoot a polar bear, and we have 269 patients to play with, which is great. So next one, let's talk methods. Next one. I want to take you straight to the sample size. Total sample size in this thing was 643 patients who got telehealth after June 2020, when the pandemic full on hit and we had to send everybody home. And we had 643 matched controls treated anywhere from 2015 forward. We have roughly the same. I would say this: a lot of people didn't answer that question about ethnicity and race. My assumptions are the vast majority of those folks are Caucasians. This is a largely Caucasian sample, 85, 90%. We had some representation from other groups, but not very much. And I would say every single one of those randomized controlled trials I showed you before, it's 90% Caucasian if it was done in the US, and probably 90 or 95 if it was done in Scandinavia. But 1,286 kids with OCD were treated in this context, and everybody got multimodal treatment. I'll talk to you about what that means. The mean age was about 14. So there was 7 to 17 were allowed. Mean age is 14, and what I'll say clinically is if you had a 7-year-old with comorbid ADHD who was climbing the bookcase, you didn't even offer tele. Like, there were a handful of cases that were being seen in person or asked to wait for in person, because we felt like this is clinically not going to work. So it wasn't like we had a huge representation of little guys. We had some who we thought could do it. But I'd say this is largely an adolescent sample. And then that raises interesting questions at the back end of what we still need to do. Next one. Measurement and criteria. We use the SciBox. We use self-report SciBox because it's impractical to have IE ratings for the large numbers of people that we have, and we're also asking to pay for their treatment. So it's harder to justify if you're not in a research trial. So we use the SciBox. We use the SciBox criteria that we cooked up with Farhad et al. In that JCAP paper, and looks like the ideal or optimized responder criteria is 35% or higher SciBox reduction to classify as a responder, and a SciBox score of 12 or lower constitutes remission. I hate the word remission, because remission to me implies reduction of symptoms over time. So to me, that's excellent response. That doesn't tell me how they're going to look at a week. But at the same time, we know from adult studies that the better you do, the better you're going to do. So if you're an adult and your SciBox at post-treatment after CBT is a 12 or lower, and I come back in a year, this is from Foa and Simpson and Mike Leibowitz, that was part of that multi-site group for a long time. Did a lot of that treatment myself. But what I would say is, if you got the patient below 12, then when we came back to do follow-ups in 6 months, they were likely to be pretty low. If the patient's Y-box, which kind of makes sense, if the patient's Y-box is 18 at post-treatment, they're going to slide back. Now, just think about it from the treatment standpoint. Why are they sliding back? Because that 18, part of what's in that 18 are rituals. So it's all, in all likelihood, this is a patient who's still ritualizing 50% of the time or more. And I'm telling you, if you leave that door open, I emphasize, item 9 on the SciBox is the most important thing in the universe of OCD. And some good studies out of Blair Simpson's group, Michael Wheaton, published a couple of papers looking at prediction. Between session adherence to response prevention is a really good predictor of outcome. If you think about what that means, is if you're resisting most of the time or nearly all the time at mid-treatment, you're likely to be a responder. If you're not, you're on a different trajectory. So let's keep that in mind as we're treating, and we're going to keep that in mind as we chat here a little bit too. PQ-LESQ, which isn't ideal for little guys, but we are more of a teen sample anyway, is the measure we use for quality of life. Okay, next slide. So we're looking at predictors and really most interested in remote treatment versus in person. We're looking at covariates such as the treatment setting, whether it was done in partial hospitalization or IOP, what was the patient's age, how long were they with us, what was their gender, what was their race, and what was their ethnicity. We also have information about their insurance payer type, which I'm going to come back to a little bit. Were you part of TADS?
No.
Okay. So TADS had an interesting, seemingly anomalous finding, which is if your family had high SES, you were more likely to be a responder to CBT alone than if your family was low SES, which was fascinating. Oh, the treatment of adolescent depression study. Sorry. Yeah. Acronyms. And so that was an interesting finding that suggests, and it's suggestive of a bunch of things, which is maybe negative life events have some impact on outcome with depression. Lots of things to think about. But we have a chance now to start doing a deeper dive on how these socioeconomic factors affect outcome. Okay, and the models are trimmed to exclude non-significant predictors. I won't talk about that because I am officially no longer a statistician. I get experts to do this stuff, and then they go away and do magic and let me know what they found. I like it much better this way. Next slide. So let's chat multimodal treatment and level of care. Next one. So in our model, and I think in a lot of models, the essential components of CBT for OCD are exposure in vivo, imaginal exposure, response prevention, and cognitive methods, if you will, more like discussion. The inhibitory learning crowd will always want you to focus on what the patient learned from an exposure. I think that's highly convergent with FOA and Kozak from '86. I mean, think about the title of their seminal paper, Emotional Processing of Fear, exposure to corrective information. So they're asking a question, which is why did their anxiety come down? And the answer is because they were exposed to corrective information. It wasn't magic, it wasn't witches. There was some, and the question Edna used to ask, and it used to really baffle people, but I get it now. Is habituation an outcome or a process? Good question. And I'm of the impression, I think Michelle Krask might be too, and a few other people, is that it's an outcome of another process. Exposure to corrective information. If I do exposure and you told me your OCD was telling you that if we touched the floor and ate within 20 minutes, we'd be throwing up, right? So when I'm doing exposure, I'm sitting on the floor, I'm touching all the gross stuff, and I can usually find a spot that looks like it might be human blood. I'm assuming it's not, but it could be. So I used it as a dipping sauce. So I touch the higher spots. I create a hierarchy within a hierarchy. We do all this stuff. And after 20 minutes, I'm looking at my watch like, well, what do you make of this? Right? I'm not just asking their suds. I mean, that's the old days. That's Wolpian behavior therapy. I'm like, well, what do you make of this? Your OCD said we'd be sick. It's been 20 minutes. Why aren't we sick? Oh, I don't know. Maybe it'll take a little longer then. Good. Okay, let's hang out here. Get some dipping sauce. It's quite good. And now we're at a 45 minutes, if we can get away with it. We're still not sick. What do you make of it? Now, I don't tell them there's a guarantee. I don't say because we're not sick now, you'll never get sick. I don't make silly claims like that. But I want them to start thinking that we're gathering information that's contrary to what OCD is telling them. And that may well be moving that process along. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to it. Next one. Now, for me, I always like to think about OCD being like Hawaii. Not that the weather is beautiful, but what it means basically is there are multiple islands, all of which can be divided into low, medium, and high. This is how I do hierarchies. This is how I think about the treatment. Low, medium, and high, low, medium, and high. Contamination island, there's a big island, which is causing the most functional impairment. You might also have harm island. You might have perfectionism island. You might have something else. 3, 4 islands. Low, medium, and high on a hierarchy. I'll just do the math. I usually want about 5 items per low, medium, and high. So 15 times 4 is what, 60? 60 items on my hierarchy. So now I'm going to get to work. But I'm not beholden to that hierarchy. The hierarchy may change in the middle of an exposure. They're giving me a hypothetical when I'm sitting in an office, and now all of a sudden, right, we're in the bathroom and things are happening. I had one patient who was doing contamination exposures as an adult. We're sitting on the bathroom floor, which she said was the highest thing ever. I can't imagine doing anything worse. And out of the corner of my eye, this is an old stage, kind of old world mental hospital type place. I see out of the corner of my eye, cockroach the size of a Buick. And she's sitting here, I'm sitting here. The cockroach and I got some eye contact going. The woman can't see him. And I'm trying to communicate with him like, what do you say? You head back into the wall. He decides, no, it's time for me to make my getaway. So and this is summer, so the woman's wearing shorts. And he comes, and he's big. He can big enough you can feel his little legs running over you. He runs over both of her bare legs and runs into the wall. So that was not on my hierarchy. My patient was very funny. She shuddered, which I understand. And she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Franklin, is he a member of your staff?" Yeah. And me being me, I'm like, he is now. Got to get him a raise. So now this is a different exposure that we plan. Or you go there and you try something and it's easy. You're right. I wish God would kill me. And it's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. I thought you said that would be a 7. Well, it ain't easy. Well, how can we make it worse? You see what I'm doing? I'm looking at where am I adding? I'm either adding rungs above where I am or below where I am. So I could spend another 12 hours on this, but I won't. I promise. So you get the idea? All right. Oh, next slide. I don't have any control. I forgot. Control is an illusion. Next slide, please. It's a bigger illusion than I thought. Oh, there we go. So we're climbing the exposure hierarchy. I spent every summer of my young life in Ireland, and we used to play a game called Snakes and Ladders. And I never knew that there was an American version of this game called Chutes and Ladders. Anyone ever play Chutes and Ladders? Like, what are the chutes? Like, where did the snakes go? And I wrote an American friend of mine saying, "What snakes? There's supposed to be snakes." I thought the snakes were more interesting. I thought that was ironic that you're playing Snakes and Ladders in Ireland, whereas St. Patrick allegedly chased all the snakes out of Ireland. Well, apparently he chased them onto this board. So what is this all about? Why do I care about this? Because you're going to do exposure, and sometimes they're going to go beautiful. And the patient's going to soar. They're going to get to 9, all next thing you know, to 31. Fabulous. That was so much easier than I thought, Doc. Thank you so much for the opportunity to work with you. It's been fabulous. Then you get up to a 62, and you have a tough exposure, and the snake poops you all the way back down to 19. That's why I think the snakes are better. Shoots are not nearly as interesting. So it seems a little voluntary. So the snake poops you back out. What are you supposed to do? You roll the dice and you keep going. Maureen Wagner has a phrase which I love. It's the only way to lose is to quit. Keep going. Yeah, it was tough. That was not what we expected. I'm sorry. Let's put it together and figure it out together. Keep moving. All right. Next slide. Now that, if you're at all concerned about illness and disease, right? Get a good look at that thing. Tetanus, for example. That is my Tonka truck from my own childhood. I got it for Christmas when I was 6. It had some hard living, and it was sitting in my backyard. And I thought to myself, what a fabulous thing to bring for the Potts Junior study, because kids like to play with trucks. And this is a suboptimal truck in terms of cleanliness. So we want to do things that are difficult. We don't want to do things that are inherently dangerous. Like there's a big shard of metal sticking out. It was the old Saturday Night Live cat. It was Jan Aykroyd. He was a salesman, and he was selling bags of glass. Yeah. It's a bag of glass. It's fun to play with. Like, no, you can't play with a bag of glass, and you can't play if there's a shard sticking out of this thing. But suffice it to say, this was good enough, and we did a lot of high-level exposure with this. Wouldn't be your first choice. You might start with something lower, low, medium, and high, low, medium, high, low, medium, high, and we get to this. Okay, next slide. Now, this is an urban one. Y'all have a subway system here, right? Sort of? All right. Well, in Philly we do. In New York, you couldn't live without it. So here's this woman standing on the yellow line. And this could be an exposure for her, she has a fear that she's going to jump in front of the train. Could also be an exposure for the person standing behind her, who has intrusive thoughts about pushing her in front of the train. And there's a train station at 36th and Market, underground subway station. I can't tell you how many times I stood on that yellow line with a patient with his or her hand on my back. That was the exposure. Now, the exposure wasn't to push me in front of the train. Not that I'm easy to move, but I'd stand there, and then they would say, I could push him. I have the thoughts of pushing him. I didn't push him. He still seems to be alive. What do we make of that? So I'm looking for corrective information, just kind of sneaking this in a little bit about treatment. Next slide. Something else to keep in mind, harm avoidance probably describes 75% of patients with OCD. They're afraid of a feared consequence. It's anxiety driven, and they're afraid that if I do X or don't do X, then Y will occur. 25%, probably a higher preponderance in kids than you'd see in adults, but not zero in adults, certainly, are more of this not just right kind of ticky feeling. And you've also got disgust on that other one. Like, it's just disgusting. Nothing's going to happen. I just hate it. It's gross. So you better know who you're dealing with. If they don't have fear consequences, I can tell you right now, all that work by Olatunji and Dean McKay talking about decay slopes for disgust versus anxiety. Disgust and not just right discomfort goes down a lot slower. We got to keep that in mind. So next slide, because if you're going to overpitch habituation to the not just right crowd, are you not setting them up for this? This is Beckett waiting for Godot or Godot. I've heard Godot recently as a pronunciation. Anyone ever seen this thing? Absurdist theater from the 60s, Irish playwright. So basically, these guys are sitting around for 2 hours talking about Godot and Godot and when he'll come. And they've been waiting for him, and he said he was going to come, and they start having these absurd conversations about when he's coming. And he never comes. He never comes. The last line of the play is, let's go. And then parenthetically to the stage orders are, they remain seated, right? So I don't want that. So if I expect you to habituate, I'm gonna emphasize that. How anxious are you now? Well, I'm like a 3. It's fabulous. Thank you, doc. If I ask a not just right person or a disgust person, what would you rate your anxiety at now? Well, a 7. It was a 7 15 minutes ago. Yeah. It's going to be a 7 forever, doc. Because sometimes they're telling you something else with that information. So we want to keep that in mind. Anyway, I digress. I'm waiting for that. Next one. So in our case, partial hospitalization is 6-hour day of programming. We have intensive outpatient 3 hours a day. Customarily at Rogers, you're gonna go through the stages. You're going to do partial first and step them down to IOP. Sometimes we get IOP cases off the street, but mainly that's the way it worked. Okay. And next one. Medication's a background factor. In our pediatric sample here, we had a pretty high, I'd say certainly not the majority, but a higher rate of no meds than I would have expected. Now, they may have had a history of meds, but they came to us, and a handful, I want to say 20% off the top of my head, had no meds. You also had a handful who had sub-optimized meds. So they're on medicine. So they come in, my daughter's been on sertraline for 2 years. How much? 25 milligrams. Like, what? And so in that case, you're going to have a subgroup that come in sub-optimized, we optimize. That's another sample group. But we did have a good chunk of patients coming in already on an optimized med. For reasonable dose and reasonable duration. They met that Franklin et al. POTS 2 study criteria for reasonable dose and duration, and they're still symptomatic. And at the higher level of care, they're symptomatic and they've often failed other treatments. Okay, next one. Let's talk results. Okay, next one. Here we go. We're looking at length of stay here. I just want to quickly walk you through this. Is if you were in-person versus telehealth, you were stayed for about an extra day in the telehealth condition. So one more day than compared to in-person. They weren't randomizing, weren't forcing this. It was all clinical decisions, but they were in for an extra day. But what's interesting is that effect size is really low, and yet it's approaching significance. What on earth is that about? You know what it's about? Giant sample sizes. So, you know, it's sort of an embarrassment of riches. So we're in psychology, we're usually like, you know, we have a good size effect and we're hoping we get over the line. Here, we got a little bit of an opposite problem here. So we got to start thinking about statistical significance versus clinical meaningfulness, and I'll get into that in a second. And what you'll also see is, in terms of the length of stay, the PHP patients were around for almost another week compared to the IOP patients. But that's also by design. So patients come to our program, and we already expect you should be doing roughly 6 weeks in PHP. You should be doing roughly 3 to 4 weeks in IOP, and it's reflected in here. So that's just nature of the beast, I guess. Next one. So I want to bring your eyes quickly. I don't want to get lost in the weeds here. These are SciBox scores going from roughly 25 to 15, 25 to 16 in the in-person versus telehealth. If you look at the effect size, within subjects effect size, I highlighted them. 1.5 for the in-person, and this was this was in the PHP program versus 1.4. And if you think about that from an effect size standpoint, you got to squint to see that difference. And 7 versus 7 in the improvements in quality of life. In IOP, 1.3 versus 1. A 1 is still a pretty large effect within subject's effect, but there is a little bit of it. You can see a little bit more of a difference. And then the PQ, LASQ, roughly the same, a little bit of a difference in the same direction. Okay, next slide. Looks like my 4th grade assignment here, which is, and if you want to get all technical about this, this is a plot of every case that we saw. There were more cases coming from 400 plus versus 200 plus in the in-person. I'm sorry, in the PHP versus IOP. But you see the black line is telling you that things are coming down over time. And not for everybody. You get some exceptions. You get some people who are hung up. Those are the people we're interested in. Like, you got a full course of our treatment and yet you're not better. What happened? Next slide. And I'm not going to bore you with this. This is about response and remission. I'll walk you through it really quickly in terms of prediction. Next slide. So we had 5 variables that were predictive of SciBox score of discharge, regardless of which condition. So we're moderators and predictors. Predictors are basically telling me these variables will tell you how well you're going to do in treatment, regardless of which treatment. Moderators, again, the holy grail is a response to a specific treatment. So telehealth was a predictor. Level of care was a predictor. People tended to do a little better in the in-person. They tended to do a little better in the PHP. Age was a predictor, tended to do a little better if you were younger, which was interesting, I thought. Length of stay, the longer you were with us, the better off you did. Diagnosis count, the more other diagnoses you had, the more your post-treatment score was a little higher compared to those with fewer, which, again, clinically makes sense. Length of stay was negatively associated with SciBox with discharge. Everything else was the other direction. Here's the take home. On average, patients receiving telehealth discharge with SciBox scores 1.25 points higher than those receiving IP in person. 1.25. Think about that. That's a 15 versus a 16 on the SciBox. Like, that is, you need an electron microscope to see that. But when you have a sample size this big, it popped. So I want to be careful to not overinterpret that. Slightly better, significantly better outcomes for the in-person, but if I really look at it, they're pretty darn comparable. And age and diagnosis count, number of diagnoses predicted the PQ-LASQ as well, not just the SciBox, both negatively. Next slide. So the search for the Holy Grail: setting, age, diagnosis count, race, white, non-white. Well, we had to do it because that was sample size. That's what got dictated. Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, and gender, all assessed. No moderator. Not at this level of analysis. Not the way we did it yet. So that was a little bit disappointing. A little bit of a trending effect, which was, I think this is interesting to think about, is telehealth might have been more beneficial for girls than for boys. Now, embedded in that might be ADHD, right? We're going to talk about climbing the bookcases, but there might be a higher preponderance of comorbid ADHD in the boys, and maybe that's part of what's driving this. We're going to have to pull it apart, and trust me, we're digging. Moderators require more power because you're looking at it in individual cells instead of across the whole thing. We have lots of plans to do a much deeper dive on this. But the first pass was that treatment response was pretty robust, regardless. Next slide. So clinical implications. What do we make of all this? To me, what I make of it is telehealth is a feasible and efficacious alternative to in-person when you can't do in-person. And when you can't do in-person, opens another set of doors. Telehealth predicts slightly higher discharge. Yeah, I get it. Especially at the IOP, we have to think about what that may mean and what other variables are predicting that. But in general, the take-home message for me is treatment response is robust across these variables. It's clinically significant reductions and comparable reductions in both groups. We're interested in that, and I think it really speaks to the importance of keeping telehealth alive. So if you're telehealth, I think you survived this test pretty well, and it's a good test. So maybe it offers that viable choice when travel and distance and paucity of local expertise limits access to empirically supported interventions. And we have this one going. I just submitted an ABCT symposium for Rogers, which also has the other program lines for us: adult OCD, adult depression, and substance abuse mental health. And every one of them, it was creepy. It was like looking. And different people wrote every abstract. Like, are you looking at my abstract? This looks similar. So again, consistently across ages and across diagnoses, we're seeing telehealth coming up pretty close to in person, at least in the context we're talking about. Next slide, please. So, got to acknowledge it. I've gotten clever enough as a writer to, when I'm writing a discussion, is I start somewhere in the middle of the discussion. I put a little paragraph in there, not at the end. I don't want it to be the last one. I want it to be ahead of that. And that paragraph usually begins in my writing with these caveats notwithstanding, because I just told you what the limitations are, and I don't want that to be the take home. Here are the reasons you should think our study findings are not relevant. Yeah, we got to acknowledge things, but I always want to end on that high note. Okay, fair enough. And this is my fair enough comment. Yeah, SES limitation, we have it. Racial, ethnic diversity, not very good, 90% Caucasian. So we have, and because of the sample size, we have enough in the other groups to start looking at outcomes. 120 patients or so. It's pretty good. May not be the biggest sample ever, but relatively speaking, yeah, it raises something that we're going to get to, which is this really where we want to wind up? We have a truncated age range. I said 7 to 17, but the reality is pushed more towards the adolescent, the little guys. We have to, because we excluded them some because it was telehealth and we thought there was no chance they could do it. So is there a chance you can do it? John Comer and I and our group showed that you can do it, but you need parental support. That was as much about parents as it was about little kids. So if you don't have that, maybe telehealth isn't your best thing. You're going to be playing with a dog for 6 hours instead of diligently doing their assessment. We had design issues in here. We didn't randomize. We didn't get randomized to pandemic versus no pandemic. We took advantage of the opportunity that was provided to us. I don't think an IRB would let you do that. Oh, darn, you've been randomized to pandemic. That's disappointing. So take advantage of what you can. But acknowledge that that's a problem. The diagnostic assessment procedure, it wasn't the kind of thing you'd see in something like CAMS or POTS. It was, clinical assessment. There wasn't an ADIS. There wasn't this painstaking assessment of measure of interviewer trained measures. We use a self-report SciBox. We got to acknowledge that. We have con meds too, so we have a flexible, diverse pharmacotherapy regimen, which I think that's an advantage clinical, because that's the real world. But I now need, because I didn't control it, but now I need to see, does optimized medicine make a difference compared to no medicine? Does optimized medicine compared to suboptimized medicine? And for those people we moved from suboptimized to optimized, did that make a difference? Because they're with us for 6 weeks, it's not forever. So we got some issues in there. And lack of follow-up assessment, because we're not running trials and no one's paying us to chase people down. So we have to acknowledge that as well. Okay, next slide. I'm a New Yorker. I used to stay out late in New York. It could be 4:30 in the morning and you would never see such a sight. At 4:30 in the morning in New York City, there's cabs looking to run you over. It's insane. Like, it's a busy place all of the time. The city that never sleeps. It's true. It's empty here. This is mid-pandemic. It's empty. This is the middle of rush hour in New York City. There's nobody out here. So the pandemic is a major conflict, right? So we have pandemic treated kids that were done via tele versus everybody else treated versus not tele. And I got this question yesterday. I presented this stuff yesterday at San Diego. A really good question about the confound. And I thought about it. I said, wait a minute. So if the confound was going to make treatment different and the sample different, we would assume the concept of the rising tide raising all boats and sick people getting sicker. I would be assuming more severe, more complicated, more comorbid, more family problems, harder to treat. So if this is going to cut in any direction, I would think it would cut against tele. And look at my data, no bloody difference. So I'm not saying it's not an issue. And going forward, we're going to have to do this where we have tele options available and in-person options available at the same time historically. And we're going to have to look at how responses worked for each group, because that's going to tighten it up. But right now we have what we have. Life gave us lemons. We decided to make a lot of lemonade. So it may not be the most tasty lemonade. There's some issues with it, but sometimes lemonade is a good way to figure out how to make better lemonade. And that's what we're going to do next. So next slide, please. What's next? We're looking at it across all 4 lines we just talked about. And Rogers has no shortage of programs that we're going to be looking at this in. And these ends are expanding exponentially. By the time I've been sitting here, we've probably treated another several hundred patients. So these ends are going to get, these are big ends, 1,286. That is shocking. And by the time I come back to do this again, or by the time the reviewers rips us to shreds and ask us to do more analyses, I won't be talking about 1,286. I'll be talking about 1,500. I'll be talking about larger, because this is an ongoing process. Okay, so on examination of treatment outcome by ConMed, we're doing that right now in this sample. We're going to take fancy machine learning approaches to try to tighten down that moderation look and start letting the algorithms tell us where we should be looking, which is fabulous and slightly scary. So I'm going to let people who know what they're talking about do that, and they may find exciting things they bring back to the group. We're looking at outcome by SES. We have some insurance data, and also race and ethnicity within the sample we have. Again, 90% Caucasian, but the 10% is, do the math, it's maybe 130 patients. And 130 patients divided across different races and ethnicities. Usually you're doing these analyses with 8 people, right? And you don't want to write home about 8 people. 130 people, maybe I have something to say. 8 people, I'm generating hypotheses. I'm not testing them, and it's okay. That's a good thing to do. I spent a lot of my early career, doing small studies and saying, wouldn't it be lovely if someday I got a grant to do this on a much larger scale? So You gotta be clever about how you do that. But we also have to recognize where we are in the field. Okay. Implications of our sampling frame for generalizability of findings. It's a good question. So the people who weren't in our sample, do we think they'll respond the same way? I don't know. They weren't in our sample. Now, I can extrapolate, I can interpolate across the empirical gaps, but in the end, I've got to acknowledge that. And there's a much broader discussion. This has really set me on fire. This broader discussion about improving access to care for everybody. Next slide. The first thing I would say, and I'm in Los Angeles, I brought a bunch of movie slides. So this is Awakenings, and to me, like 643 kids did pretty darn well in telehealth in the middle of a pandemic. It was sometimes about the symptoms that they had. Like, that's pretty good. So do we want to now let insurance companies close the door? They're already starting to do it. Well, you got to get these kids back into clinic. Like, but why? Like, this is like stopping them from closing the door, I hope, if they're responsive to data, and I would hope you would be. But to me, like we're learning something from this, and we know clinically there's some people I should be treating via tele. Hoarding, like having a hoarder come to your office with a box of stuff when you know there's a storage facility and a car. I was telling John a horrific story about a hoarding case I treated once, and I was asking questions about what was in what room. And the woman looks at me, she kind of puts her head down, and she says, well, the room at the top of the stairs is the place that we keep the living cats. And my response, because I'm done this a lot, and my response was, oh, so I take it there are other kinds of cats. And there were. And she couldn't bring herself to do it. They had passed away at various stages, and instead of dealing with them, she moved them into the back room, she called it, and needed my assistance. Usually when I treat hoarding, I don't touch anything, I just haul. This time I'm like, it strikes me that you need help here. Would it be okay if I took care of this for you? She's like, yeah, can I be out of the house? Sure. When you treat hoarding, another thing that my interns have learned, this might even be the same house, is I show up to the house to meet my intern. We're going to go through this house, and he shows up like in a fancy suit with like a pocket watch, and I'm wearing ripped jeans and an old sweatshirt and with a bandana, looking like I just came off the truck. And he looks at me and he says, you don't look like you're dressed for work. And I look at him and I say, when you open that door, you're going to realize it's you that's not dressed for work. When you're going to do this kind of stuff, you better know where you are, because it's embarrassing to them. They don't want to have somebody in with a fancy pocket watch who now is going to have to touch their rat-infested living room. I've seen living stuff in here too. The cats were the least of it. And you'll habituate that too. Trust me, you get used to anything. So it's an old Springsteen line. You get used to anything. Pretty soon it just becomes your life. In this case, all right, give me some bags. Anyway, so we don't want the telehealth light to go out. I think hoarding is a place where this would really help tremendously. So I want to make sure we try to leave this one. So, oh, next slide. This is my place to rant. Anyone ever seen this movie? Yeah, it's a little bit dated. You see it? No. So it's not dated, it's just obscure. Huh. Thank you for that. So, Elysium, and anyone who knows our Greek history knows what I'm talking about. The movie is about, basically, it's a dystopian hellscape movie, except for one small problem to me, which is it's a dystopian hellscape that's kind of pretty realistic in that we've destroyed the earth. It's worth almost nothing. And the poor people have to go and try to get resources from what's left of the earth. The rich people live on a satellite that's separate from the poor people. And so they are served by the people who are still stuck on earth. Problem becomes, and this is the pivoting point of the movie, is Matt Damon is poisoned. And the only place he can get the help he needs is up on the satellite. and he appeals to the various people and says, I need to go to the satellite, I'm going to be dead in 48 hours. And they have a little tribunal and say, it's too bad for you. And I'm watching this movie like, this is healthcare. This is healthcare in this country. Too bad for you. So my next slide. It's a slice. I won't even get into why I'm looking at epi data from SES data from Rochester, New York. That's what this is. You could take this slice in every single city in this country, Rochester, New York, and the surround, the Finger Lakes region. SES1 is people making under $40,000 a year. SES2 under 80, 120, 160, and 200. So the last group is making roughly 200 grand a year as a family or more. Okay. SES1 is racially and ethnically diverse. SES2 less so. SES3 and 4 less so. SES5 almost exclusively Caucasian. So, to me, this represents the problem of having insurance dictate whether you get the treatment. Because if you have good insurance, you can get the treatments I just described. You can get them at outpatient, you can get them a higher level of care, you get res, anything you want. If you're in SES 4 and 5, world is your oyster. If you're in SES 1, or probably even SES 2, the likelihood is you don't have access. In some ways, what this is to me, and this is horrifying, is it's like I have a rule for entry into my country club. And my only rule, I accept everyone, except those who do not own luxury boats. If you don't own a luxury boat, we can't have you in the club. And luxury boat ownership has some of these other things embedded in it because of systemic racism. Let's be honest. And to me, I think my question is this who we want to be? Is this who we want to be? That we have treatments that work for all of these conditions at multi-levels of care for really sick people. It can get them better. And yet you can only get them if you own a luxury boat. I don't sleep well with that. Next slide. I think this might be my last one. This is a rant I'm going to continue. Anyone ever seen this movie? Network? Howard Beale? I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I've been accused in times of making this my Howard Beale moment. And I'm okay with that because I think if we're not part of this solution, we are perpetuating a problem. We have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to create? What kind of world do we want to live in? So I'll challenge everybody in this room to start thinking about that. And I know you're going to get pushback. I know people, oh, it's really hard to do. Oh, Medicaid. Yeah, I know. Well, you know what we do about that kind of stuff? We get politicians to talk to one another. We go talk to them. I don't think we can just simply throw up our hands anymore because we've been doing it for too damn long. All right, enough of Howard. Questions?
Thank you, Marty. That was an amazing talk. Fantastic. We have time for just maybe one or two questions. The first question is, can you briefly talk a little bit more about the treatment for disgust versus harm avoidance?
Sure.
Because that's a tough one.
Yeah. I'd say habituation is not your friend. But repeated prolonged exposure may be anyway. I don't expect you to habituate very much. What I'm trying to do is change your relationship to that feeling. I want you to tolerate its presence better. I want you to function despite it. So if it goes away, it's fabulous. If it doesn't go away, doesn't matter. And if you hear what I'm already doing, anybody familiar with Steve Hayes? Don't you ever read Steve Hayes? I read Steve Hayes. It reminds me of reading James Joyce. Like, it is intentionally obscure, but the concepts are plain as the nose on your face, which is, here's what I want you to do. I want you to ignore your private experience and go about your important business. Clarify what that business is and should be, and do that. If you're anxious, tough. If you're not anxious, fabulous. Just that your focus needs to change. I think I had this as a phrase I use. I don't even know Jesus and it sounds bad, which is if you continue to value your comfort over your functioning, eventually you'll have neither. We got to discuss. It's not about whether you'll. I tell them overtly, I don't think you're ever going to love this. I don't think you're ever going to love looking at a dumpster and seeing a rat looking around for stuff. I don't think you're ever going to love maggots. Who loves maggots? But like my point is, you may always have a reaction to it. My real point in treatment is your initial reaction to it shouldn't dictate what you do. I'm changing my approach. I'm changing what I'm asking, and I do think I'm invoking different theories. Because if I'm sitting here telling you you're going to habituate, and you're half an hour in at the maggots, and we're still looking at them, and you're still going like this, and when Lars Oss always taught me, don't let him make that face. This face, it's in a form of avoidance. So he would ask people in the treatment of small animal phobias to not make the face, which I thought was interesting. So there's things you can do to modify, but in the end, I don't want to sell you something that you really won't own. I don't want you waiting for Godot or Godot or whatever he was. I think he was God. That's another matter altogether. That's one question.
Fantastic. I think that's all the time we have for questions. But I just want to say, in our clinic, we have done almost exclusively telehealth for the last 2 years, and ticking almost 2 years exactly this week, I think. And it's so nice to see data suggesting what we have found clinically, that not for everyone, but on average, the tele seems to work as well. And in some cases, even better, because it gives you a window into the patients, the kids, and the families' real lives at home. We haven't found any dead cats in any of our patients' homes yet, but
that's good.
Good, I know. In terms of doing exposures, it really is great to do it in a more of a generalizable and realistic environment for them. So this is really great to know.
And to spin off of your comment as a last thing is, we had a kid who was in person, then we had to go virtual, and her biggest problem was that there were ghosts in her basement. And in person, we're giving her every day the same assignment: go down to the basement and go hang out with the ghosts. Come back, didn't do it. Go home, hang out with the ghosts. Didn't know how to do it. When we switched to tele, the therapist was there, like, take the computer and go down and show me the damn ghosts. Sorry about that. And so, within 3 sessions, done. This is something that was 3 weeks, 3 sessions. So the times where it can be advantageous, I think at the very least, it's not disadvantageous for most patients. So we got to figure out who we can use it for and who we can't.
Well, it's fantastic discussion. Marty, you are very educational. We've learned a lot, and very entertaining, and that's why I love listening to your talks. And I just want to thank you very much for sharing some time with us today, this wonderful study, and your insights and pearls of wisdom into treating OCD. So again, thank you very much, and we hope to get you back soon.
Thank you.